All right, welcome everybody to Royals and Rogues production review. I'm calling it the production review because it's just in my head, but this is where we
So
go
it's a live
live.
stream. Rose Rogues live
It
stream.
doesn't matter. Same thing. So this is the live stream that we like to do every week where Alec and I will discuss different theory and just kind of go off of uh, figuring out why my taste in art is always superior.
Okay,
So
yeah, that's what we do. That's exactly what we
I'm
do.
I'm Robert. I'm a producer on a short film we've been working on, Tycho Decay. Alec is the director and founder of Royals and Rogues. This week's topic is going to be why you need to stop explaining your movie rules. And this is going a little bit off of what we've discussed in previous weeks, but at the root of it is the fact that often when we're watching entertainment now, we get really annoyed with the fact that you'll have people will explain things too much in a story, and it's unnecessary. So, uh, Alec, how you doing? Everything
Doing
going well?
good, doing good. Yeah, the essentially, I say this every week, but I'm gonna keep saying it. This is just the educational part. The whole goal of Rose and Rogues is to equip artists, right? I started the company because I was like, I don't like working for other people, and I don't like the way people treat artists. So I'm like, let me start my own thing, and let's put this in the hands of the artists, right? There's no middle management at my company. It's me, the client, and then artists. And it was really cool seeing Godzilla talk recently. There, Godzilla minus one. There's an interview with the director about the VFX and how, wow, how'd you get it all done on like such a small budget with the quality you had? And his answer was like literally, he's like, I just cut out all the middle management. There's no middlemen. It was just me talking to the VFX artists, and that made it like a fraction of the cost, like a almost like 100th of the cost of like some of these other productions, and it got done way faster. And it's like, and everyone seemed to have a better time on it, and it's like that's what it's all about. Like let's make life better for the people that create the stuff that we all love. And so one of the ways of doing that is by education, right? It's like, hey, some of it's hiring artists where I can, but I can only hire so many. And then some of it's, hey, let's get people taught. So there's tutorials, which is why most of you are here. And if some of you from the tutorials want to know more about filmmaking, like, well, how do I actually make it interesting or engaging or not bad, as in most of the stuff we see today? Then this is what this is for. This is the film theory side of things. So today's film theory, like Rob just said, is let's talk about expanding on it's a DLC I said to like something we talked about 2 weeks ago and last week, which is more or less like the internal logic of your film. Does it matter? How does it matter? How does it imply? 2 weeks ago we talked about the idea of willing suspension of disbelief, and it's like, well, you don't really have to rely on that if you have a logically consistent world. And so then we talked about, well, where can you break those rules? Like when the rule of cool, is that allowed? When can you do that? And then this week, I think what I wanted to get into is sort of the idea of it's really tempting once you realize there's kind of two schools oftentimes, right? There's like the school of the people that are like, it's cool, it doesn't matter, I don't care. And then there's sort of the opposite side, which are the people that are like, well, if it's rule based, then I should know all the rules and I should explain everything. And on the thumbnail, I have Tolkien and Brando Sando, right? Brandon Sanderson, and I like both of these authors. I think both of them have interesting approaches to writing, but they have completely different approaches to when it comes to explaining like the rules of their universe and their magic systems and everything else. So it's more than just soft magic versus hard magic systems, right? It was like there's something bigger going on here when it comes to this idea of how much should you let the audience know about your rule sets. So first, let's kind of establish what we're talking about with a few examples. Rob, what do you have for us?
All right. Well, yeah, it's interesting because I'm going to be trying to stay away from more of the magic side. I think that what
Right.
really comes down to is when you're trying to explain everything. Good examples of that are going to be like the movie Arrival that came out in 2016. If people haven't seen it, I think it's probably in my top 10 movies.
Right.
Um, and another good example is going to be The Martian. Both of these are good films that are focused on explaining out the rules in how the universe or how the story is working, specifically because it's integral to the plot.
Right.
If you don't get the explanation, you won't really understand what's going on. So it's an essential factor of each of them. Um, I think that's going to be the key thing when it comes to what you're doing is whether or not this is essential. Um, the counterexample, like you mentioned, Lord of the Rings, that's a good show of where you don't need to explain magic at all.
Right.
That's something that's not necessary because it's used within reason within the story. It's not going all over the place, so you kind of know that it's contained in a certain way. A similar one that I've always enjoyed is War of the Worlds, and I compare this to Independence Day
Yeah.
because War of the Worlds is basically Independence Day, and they both end the same way, except
Right.
in War of the Worlds they just say it must be microbes. But
Hmm.
there's so many microbes that the aliens couldn't understand and infected them. Independence Day just does that, but it gets specific when it may not necessarily need to, but they go with it, which is, oh, it's a cold virus. It's like,
Right.
great. Viruses, microbes, in what they're trying to do and how they affect the aliens, they're basically the same way, and what they're doing at the end of the story. So those are the four, I should say, that stick out in my mind when I see good examples of explaining everything or explaining nothing.
Right. So, and War of the Worlds does a really good job with this because it's kind of funny because I think a lot of times a critique that gets leveled against storytelling is like, oh, it doesn't make sense or wasn't logical or I didn't know why that happened or whatever. And it's actually not that important if you actually make a gripping and a good story, right? So when you have something like War of the Worlds, the aliens arrive and it's just like they just here. We don't know like how they can travel. We don't know why they can travel. Even in the more modern one where they come from like under the ground, which is kind of cool visually. It's not like it's like I guess they came here and like seated and were waiting or something, but it's kind of BS, right? Like you still just get like an excuse more or less than an actual like consistent like scientific answer. Um, and there's times where I think that that's really valuable. I don't think either approach is necessarily wrong, by the way, right? Because there's sort of this argument of like, well, it's better if you have like if you know everything, you give everyone all the information, and then I can hold you accountable or something like that to your own rule set. But the answer is like that's not actually the most important part of filmmaking, and so what you have to ask is like what type of story am I telling, and then what does the best job of that. So depending on the type of story you're telling, is going to dictate how much of your internal logic you're going to unveil right to the audience, how much they actually need to know. And so when you have a story like I think Lord of the Rings is a good example of this, is like knowing how the magic works really isn't an important part to this story whatsoever. Like it's all about character, it's about symbology, right? If that's a word, symbolism. It's about good versus evil, about love, and like all these sort of concepts that um, you know aren't necessarily enhanced given the way the characters interact with the world by having like everything, knowing everything. And what's cool about Tolkien in my mind is like he actually has it all written down somewhere. Like he has this logic. He just doesn't like tell you, right? And he doesn't sit there and go like, "Oh, this is why Gandalf at this point in time can do this, and at this point in time he can't." Right? He doesn't really tell you that. He just has them in one moment do something, turn trolls to stone or something, and then later on he doesn't do it. And sometimes the characters, even in his own world, theorize about stuff, which is kind of fun. They'll be like, well, wait, why didn't this work? And he's like, you don't get the answer always, right? And so,
Hmm.
versus like you were saying with something like Arrival, well, that's essential, right? It's essential to these characters to figure out, oh, this whole time loop is happening, because of
Oh,
the way.
spoilers,
Oh,
man.
well, we're going to talk about spoilers. That's an old movie. But let me just put this: if you're watching my channel, I don't believe in spoilers for any movie that's like over like a year and a half. Like if
Wow,
you
that's
haven't,
aggressive.
no, it's not. If you haven't
That's aggressive.
taken the time to go watch something, then you shouldn't care that much about it. Like you shouldn't care. So like you're gonna come across spoilers just in the real world. Like this is a whole nother discussion, but it's a fun rant. I'll indulge it for just a little bit here. But like the whole world around spoilers has gotten is so garbage. Like the whole like Reddit attitude about like everything's a spoiler. You can't tell if I know there's a car, if I know there's a Batmobile in the Batman movie, that's a spoiler. Or if I'm like, because like I've had this discussion where I've said like online, I was like, oh, I really loved Ashthorpe's design for the Batmobile. People are like, no spoilers. I'm like, spoilers. It's a Batman movie. There's gonna be a Batmobile, and they're like, well, I didn't know that, and you're like, okay, we're not. What are we dealing with? Children here? We're like everything. Even kids don't even care this much. Like spoilers are literally like Dumbledore dies. That's a spoiler. Luke, I am your father. That's a spoiler. A major
Yeah,
plot point that there'd be
yeah, those are
no
spoil.
way for
Yeah.
you to guess outside of watching the film. Knowing there's like a concept in a film, or like Back to the
I
Future has time travel, or Arrival has aliens, that's not a
okay,
spoiler.
okay. I don't know why we're ranting about this, to be honest, because I don't know why that's a thing,
Oh,
or
I
like
it's
why
just
this bug.
it's
I've
something I
never run into
see
this.
in the
You
world
gotta get
all the time.
You got to
It
get off the internet
bothers
then,
me.
because I straight up the minute you're like, oh, well, there, I was like, I'm with you, I'm with you, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not with you because I don't understand what this is or what's going on.
Oh, it's fine. It's just it's
All right,
this whole internet culture of considering everything a spoiler and taking
okay,
it way too
okay. Well,
seriously. Like
yeah, I'm
the
bringing you back to the story then, because
that's fine.
that is very different from what I said about Arrival.
That's well, yeah. Anyways, so but what's cool about Arrival is and spoiler alert, by the way, for all the movies that we mentioned
Thank you,
here.
I appreciate that.
Um, but what's cool about Arrival is it has this um the it gives you all the rules you need for it to actually be really rewarding when it checks these things off, right? And it's because
Hmm.
that's what the story's about, right? The story's partly about science. The story's partly about like this infinite loop that we're trying to establish, right? And that means that you need to know the rules for to explain how that works. So um that's I think kind of a two pillars, right? We can look at various, we gave various examples, but that's like, so then the question becomes like, is one better than the other? Why use one versus the other? When should you use rules? What are the advantages and disadvantages? And I'll let you
Well,
answer that while I
well,
take a sip.
well, yeah. While you're saying that, so I would say, okay, there's two things. First, one is what we're really talking about, and I mentioned this before to you.
Right.
Um, it's Chekhov's gun, which is the idea of if you put something in a story, it needs to be essential, otherwise it shouldn't be there. If explaining the rules in your story is essential to telling that story, then you need to be explaining the rules. If it's not essential to telling your story, then you don't need to be explaining it. Um, we didn't bring this up before, but Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones,
Right.
the magic in those movies, the literal magic in the movies, it's never explained,
Right.
and it doesn't need to be. It's not essential. It's a story that's based off of pulp serials, so
Right.
you don't that was never a part of it. It's not important to it. And then before we even go to about why or why not, we've those are good examples. Bad examples are going to be things like Star Wars with
Okay. Yeah.
midichlorians. You're giving the audience, suddenly you're taking something that people accepted, the Force,
Right.
and you're now trying to give the audience something specific that you can put numbers to, and but that just starts causing the audience to get confused because it's contradicting what you've previously said in your stories, and then you're never really giving us a reason why it's important. Like
Hmm.
really, if you didn't tell us this thing, would it be necessary? Um, I know enough about Star Wars to know that what George Lucas wanted to do is have it be important in his last trilogy, but he didn't
Right.
but it didn't go that way, unfortunately. I also think that's a point where you can kind of say like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be going down this route. Um, Another good one is Avatar, that telling the audience that the air is toxic is totally fine.
Right.
Telling them that it's methane suddenly makes everyone go, okay, I now know something specific. So certain audience members will sit there and think, well, methane's flammable, right? So
Right.
if it's flammable, then why is it like, but like
Well,
if
well,
you
and
had
then
left it
they
vague, it would have been better.
right, and they also said like there's not enough oxygen to breathe, right? And you're like, well, then how
Yeah.
is there enough oxygen for fire? So either it should be, so it's like I guess you're replacing oxygen with methane, and so like you have to like you've added a little too much there, right? Like we just said. So I think there's this
It, it's
whole
com yeah, it's completely unnecessary. And
right.
then my last the last example that I think that a lot of people don't I don't know if people overlook it, but it was something that has always bothered me was Pacific Rim because
Mhm.
it's a good movie, but why do you need two pilots? Well, the explanation is you need to have brain
Right.
waves and it's too much of a mental load and blah blah. And you go down this list and you're like, or you could have just simply said that you have a co-pilot and a pilot and they need to be in sync because that's what you do on airplanes. You have a co-pilot and a pilot.
Right.
Where do they sit? In the same spot. they need to be in sync in case like you could just simply say, well, it's too expensive to have someone, a pilot get a concussion and suddenly we're out one, Jaeger. It's like,
Right.
oh yeah, that's a good explanation. You need a second pilot there just in case.
Right.
Just leave it at
Well,
that.
and
So if
it's a
you
complex machine, right? So like you're
Mhm.
handling the guns, I'm handling the walking, right? You're like whatever.
Yeah,
Like
you can go along with those, and that's where it's like if you give too much information, again, it's not necessary really to give those things, except someone felt in the back, oh, I really need to explain why we're doing this. And it's like, well, okay, but is it help actually for the story?
right.
But then that brings us to, yeah, like you said, like why and when should you explain versus not explain?
Right.
That's really what it comes down to. But how can you tell when it's necessary is kind of the biggest issue I think people run into when they're trying to tell a story.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. And well, and you also want to have some world building, right? Like there I will say I think what happens a lot of times is um people start building a world, they fall in love with this world they're building and they want to tell people like everything in it. Like they have like you're Tolkien, right? And you've invented Elvish and you invented like all these things. And then it's rare for someone to show like restraint and not be like, oh no, this is why it's so cool because here's how my whole magic systems works and here all the and like really what you don't realize what you're doing is you're kind of showing don't tell it not you're telling not showing, right? You're like over explaining things to the audience like whatever it is, and then you're also kind of getting caught up in this like and putting walls up where you don't necessarily need to put them yet, right? So there, even with like the whole Gypsy Danger situation, right? There might be a like cool in-universe reason where like well, in episode 6 I kind of want to do this thing, or like in the future we're gonna find out that humans are like partly psychic, and that's sort of an important like thing because the kaiju and the humans are connected through a psychic wavelength, and like like, but by including all that and telling everyone everything very early on, you're putting in all these walls that now you have to play with it. Like now you're like, and then what? And this is what notice happening all the time is like, um, as the series goes on, you're establishing more and more like canon essentially, right? And then people get upset when you go and break all of it all of a sudden, and it's like, well, wait a second, well, why'd you establish all that if you're just going to throw it out the window? And the answer is like, oh, you kind of did it unintentionally, right? You kind of
Hmm.
like let this happen because you got overzealous about certain things. And so I think I'd be curious to hear what you think is like. What would you determine the when to add something that's a specific rule or a limiting factor to your world explicitly, and when you would kind of let that be intuited by the audience.
I think that if I'm going to be telling a story, um, I think it's going to be when it is you're going to be probably not necessarily breaking the rule, but you're going to run into the rule where it's like or you're maybe if you're going to try to break the rule. A good example is this, like if you're going to have some internal logic, if you ask yourself, would this character normally do X, or like can they do X? So even if you don't state the rules, it's like, okay, for example, if your character can your character normally teleport to the moon? If the
Mm-hmm.
answer is no, then you're breaking the story's logic. So
Right.
you have to then say, okay, well, I have to come up with a reason to allow them to do this now, whereas they couldn't do it before. Um, you know, that is one way of doing it. Of like, okay, if I'm going to be breaking the rule, I need to have a reason that's set up to allow that.
Right. I'm I'm
Um,
I'm actually not the biggest fan of that one because I think that's generally like the comic book way of writing,
very much.
right? It's
It's
like,
well, that's the
oh,
thing
this needs
is
to happen. So now Batman gets this new tool that lets him do it. And so that, but now you put that tool on the shelf and it's like, okay, what about next time? Like let's say he
yes,
figures out how to get
but that's a
unfrozen
bad
or
way. But
something.
that's again, that's a bad way. That is
Right.
a way of doing it, but it's a bad way of
Okay.
doing
So
it
what's
effectively.
a good way of
So
doing it?
but that's what I mean though, is like you can still do that. Like for example, you have to explain what the force is in order for Luke to be able to use it down the line. Otherwise, you're gonna be like, well, why was he able to do that? You have to explain, okay, here's what the force is, so that he can use it later on and we can understand it. If you don't explain what the force is in Star Wars, then having Luke just feel basically is what it would feel, from the audience viewpoint, you would see Luke feel and then shoot a torpedo and blow up the Death Star. And you'd sit there and be like, he
Well,
just guessed.
I'm a little confused here. What do you mean by explain what the Force is? Because
So
I'm not quite tracking like how that's
so the
uh,
Force is explained in
different
Star Wars.
than mini chlorians. Okay,
But
so
the Force is explained in Star Wars is that it is a I don't want to use the word force in the definition, but it's
a
in all
power in the
things.
universe.
It's a power that flows within the universe in all things and allows you to reach out and kind of control things around you, in effect, or to reach out and touch those things as well.
Hmm.
And so that's what it's established as.
Okay.
If you took that out of Star Wars, that explanation, and you just said, "Oh, he's a Jedi," Obi-Wan's a Jedi, and I'll train you how to be a Jedi, but he doesn't
They're
explain
just
how,
knights. We
except
just say they're knights.
yeah, you're just like, well, that doesn't make any sense then at the end of the movie, where if you don't explain what the Force is, hearing Obi-Wan say use the Force would have made no sense to the audience.
Right.
You'd have sat there and been like, okay, use the Force. Why are you not using the radar as well? It's like,
Hmm.
okay, well, it was explained to us early on. So that's a good way of doing it. You have to, we don't have to know exactly what the Force is. We don't need to know what the limitations are in specifics, but we have to have at least an understanding of how it's going to be used in the end.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think that's part of it. I think for me, another part of it is like I don't. I'm curious to keep going down this road. Cause I'm give me a couple more examples because I'm not sure if I'm agreeing or following or if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying
well,
here.
certainly.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll go. So the next thing is, well, I don't want well, I guess I'm going to be using spoilers then. So Arrival is another good example.
Okay.
Is you have to early on in the movie, we're given a good example as to a perfect example, which is actually why Amy Adams's character is chosen for the mission,
Hmm.
of why being specific in language is important
Right.
because a different translation, a different interpretation of a ancient dead language means something very can be very different. So one character says, they ask, what did he say the Sanskrit word meant? And he said an argument. And it's like, and she responds, and he asks her, well, what do you think it is? And she said, it is like a comparison of cows. Because the specific thing is actually about cows,
Hmm.
but the cows represent something that can lead to war. It's effectively. It's like,
Right.
oh, okay, so I understand the cat that word means something specific in that language. And they're basically saying context matters because that sets it up for the rest of the story to be to work. Is you have to understand, okay, the context of these words matter. That's why I'm asking these specific questions, and then they go into the language and all that.
Hmm.
Kind of breaking down sentences. So it's the same type of thing, which is like, okay, you're giving me an understanding of what you're trying to set up early on. That's what I mean when I say, um, if you're going to have a rule where it's like, oh, this person can now do this, it's like, great. Usually we understand that as growth within the character. The character needed to go through something, needed to, understand the stakes, kind of go through the call if you're talking about the hero's journey to get to
Hmm.
the end point to be able to become a stronger, more better person. But it can, and you can do that with anything really. Determinate, oh, they have the determination, or they are now willing to go and um, sacrifice themselves so that everybody else can live in the movie. That's usually what we're talking about within that. Is if we're talking about the rules, it doesn't have to be something specific to assign, sci-fi or to fantasy. The principle applies for both of those. The principle can apply in a science fiction movie the same way that it applies in a drama about someone, realizing that they've been a jerk and they need to be a nicer person.
Hmm.
That's kind of what I mean by that. That's a good rule of thumb. It's the same type of thing where does your character need to show specific info, traits about themselves.
Hmm.
If you have a character who's supposed to be playing uh, a certain role, like they're the jokester in the group in your buddy cop movie, do we really need to show them when they're not being, how they treat their family or something? It's like
Hmm.
maybe not. Maybe that's a scene that needs to be cut from the movie because it's making the movie too long.
Right. Yeah,
So
I think it's interesting. I think you've zoomed it out to I think sort of like the overarching idea of like when to explain almost anything, right? Like not just the rules of your world, not just the science, um, but like or the magic or the whatever, right? But like this is sort of like what to include in a story at all, almost to a
yeah,
certain
yeah.
extent. I want to dial in a little bit
Hmm.
and sort of talk about um because what I always think of, one of my favorite comparisons is like and I think originally I titled this like explain everything or explain nothing. And what I mean by that is I think sort of one of the worst things you can do is give the audience like almost no information and then give them like with midi chlorians, right, one little thing that sort of like just makes you go like, huh, well, why did you tell me that? If you told me that, then it must be important, right? And so to me, I think one of the things you can do is like you can explain a lot, you can give people a lot of rules, but then you have to play with those rules and they have to be important and you should be using them on a regular basis. And so like it's one of those things where I think like Star Trek does this, right? Star Trek, usually every episode they set up a bunch of rules for the episode, and they have like how everything works, like whether it's the bridge, whether whatever, like they're very nerdy about like here's how it all works.
Yeah.
um and this is this race and this is what this alien race like does or doesn't do, and then they play with the rules. That is sort of the story. It's this little like mind puzzle where um it's like here's how this new technology is, or here's how this robot is, and then it breaks in a certain way that you're like, oh shoot, I know and they know, and then you can figure it out, right? Brandon Sanderson does this really really well with the Mistborn series in metallurgy, right, which is more than just a magic system. It's also like a plot element and all this other stuff, but it's like, oh, he lets you know like this is what this does, here's how it does that, and here's why it does what it does, and then there's expectations now, and he does a really good job of then meeting those expectations, right, having them all matter. And so that's also, I think, Arrival does really well, and I think we'd all critique it if it set up all these sorts of like little rules and a bit of information, and at the end there's just like a deus ex machina. We'd be like, wait a second, that doesn't feel good at all. Like you set up all these rules for how we're going to get out of this, and instead, like, let's say she gets out of it by just being like realizing that you know I don't know, she has something completely unrelated to the language and the time thing that then puts an end to this like inevitable war, right? Or puts an end to the aliens just leave out of their own volition or something. You'd be like, this is not really satisfying. Why'd you set up all those rules?
Yeah.
Versus you can have a world where you don't set up these rules, right? Like and aren't doing that, and it can still be a good film. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like what I kind of lean towards is like do one or the other, like be conscious about it, because once you start putting in rules, very quickly I think your movie has to become about those, right? So it's like Chekhov's gun is kind of what you talked about, what we're really talking about here. So it's like if you're gonna put in a bunch of Chekhov's guns pointing in like different directions, then they better all fulfill in interesting ways.
Yeah.
Or you can put up like just one or none, and that's good. But the worst thing you can do is sort of have a mix of each, where you're like you're not quite pulling off the magic trick of like a memento or something, right? Where it's like this moment where you're like, oh, that's so cool. All this comes like all these dominoes you set up are all coming to fruition in a very interesting way. Or you can be like, look, I'm just really focusing on this like one domino, and when it falls, oh my gosh, you guys are gonna be, it's just huge, and it's just an epic story that's just like, oh wow. And that's like Lord of the Rings, where there's not a bunch of these little things that he's like set up that are being ticked off that then feel rewarding when they happen. Instead, you're more of like, it's more about the journey and the overarching thing. So it's like, don't get distracted by like all these little plot points that I could be setting up. Don't be, if I mention a character as a lord of some tower somewhere, don't worry about it too much, right? Don't worry about the Tom Bondabills. Don't worry about the the third wizard that's like the green wizard or whatever. Like we're not going to worry about those things too much. We're really about the story. Versus I think there are kind of two approaches to storytelling, right? And I think one approach is organic, and it's a lot more, I think it sort of is what we think of when we think of movies and storytelling. It's like sort of this flow. And then the other approach is like very difficult to do well, but when done well, very, very satisfying. And um and I think the worst thing you can do is sort of be a bit like middle ground with these two ways, which is sort of like a Pacific Rim, right? It's like really you're just a fantasy, guys. It's giant robots fighting giant monsters. You don't really have to explain any of the science, and
Yeah.
there's actually multiple moments that are really bad with that film where it's like gypsies analog, and you're like, what analog? Like, but there's clearly electronics in it, like, and I guess it means its core, like just like its core is a nuclear core, and therefore the nuclear core powers the electronics. So those electronics stay working, but you're like, it kind of ruins it, throws you out of the film whenever you hear it, and it's just sort of this weird like gypsies analog. You're like, you could have just been like, have it miss, like have it hit like other things, right? Or have it like have them like dodge it in an interesting way or whatever. Have it be a blast instead of a, or like a horizontal blast that they like slide under and everything else gets hit with the electrical discharge or something. Or it's or arcs.
Yeah.
Have it be an arcing blast, like a bunch of electric things, and then it misses them with it, or they get something else to conduct it. There's a bunch of ways to have that happen without having to add a rule to your universe that now it's like, what? Now they play with that again later on where they like blow up Gypsy Danger and it's like an atomic bomb, right? I believe.
Yeah.
Spoiler
Yeah,
alert for
I
Pacific
think
Rim.
so.
Um, but again, like I would think none of us really care. Like the rules aren't really important there, right? It's not like you're sitting here setting up all these rules to tick them off in an interesting way. And that's where I kind of say like commit. Like if you're gonna set up rules, know you're setting up rules. Make them fun, make them interesting, have them have payoff. It's very hard to do. I think it's kind of an advanced technique where you have to be keeping track of like all of your script points and all your story points and like be very conscious. And I don't think it works very well. Here's why I think comics actually fall apart. Like everyone's like, oh, canon. I think the biggest problem with them is there's always going to be there's different authors, right? And so that's kind of your biggest
Yeah.
problem is you're going like somebody's setting up all these rules and then somebody else is coming in later who isn't aware of like a good 70% of like the canon, the rules, and then they have to write something in this universe and it's like
Well,
they're not
the
going to be able to
idea,
follow those.
comics are modern day American comics are a little bit different because of how they were created. Again, those were also very serialized previously. It
Right.
wasn't really something that really followed along. Um, you could say that you could have people set up to where it does matter and you can have issues. The problem is with that type of thing is where someone comes in and says, we need to have them be able to do X. And this is actually where I might get in trouble. I don't like Superman as a hero.
No
Um,
argument from me.
but it's not because he's not interesting as a character. It's that they have done things with him that makes it boring
Hmm.
effectively. Like if you look at Superman and his origins and where he gets his powers from, it doesn't make sense that he can fly.
Right.
Um, if you want to kind of allow him to fly because he's been able to fly for so long, okay, you can go with that and do it. But then there's also the fact that, and this is something that's always bothered me, you could make Superman a very interesting character if you just simply introduced physics to his stories. Now, again, I
Hmm.
haven't read a lot of his comics.
Right.
Unfortunately, I've read a lot of DC comic runs, but never really gotten to Superman stuff.
Yeah.
Mainly because the 2000s turned me off when they had the red and blue Superman stuff.
I
That
can't
was just
even remember half of
it was dumb. It was dumb.
that.
But they split Superman up into like two people. There was one that was blue and one was
Oh
red.
wow.
It was dumb. It was
Okay.
terrible. But the key thing is that if you introduce the idea of physics, which is like, for example, if a plane is falling and someone grips it from the nose and tries to like lift it up, like if you basically stand up and hold a bus in the middle,
Right.
the
It
bus is
splits. Yeah.
it's going to split in half
Hmm.
because the actual metal can't hold together in that way. It's not
Right.
built that way. So if you play that and have Superman cognizant of that, then he has to come up with unique and interesting ways to be able to stop a bus from,
Right.
falling off of a bridge or something. That suddenly makes him an interesting character because then you will recognize he is intelligent in that regard. B, that he is now working around constraints. So
Right.
that's kind of the same thing as author, bringing that back just to kind of wrap it up.
Hmm.
That's the same thing you do with authors is if you write a story and you get to a point where you're like, oh, because I've done this plenty of times. You write a story, you get to a point in it, and you go, "Oh, this doesn't work because it doesn't make sense why they're doing X, Y, and Z. They would need this thing. Where would they pick it up? They can't just pull it out of nowhere. So then you have to go back to the beginning of your story
Right.
and rewrite it so it can work up to that scene, or change it around, or you have to change what is actually happening in the scene.
Right.
And I've had that where it's like, yeah, you're at a big action set piece and you're just not really sure where to go. You're like, oh crap, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing here. Or this is what I want to have happen because this would work really well, but I don't know where they got the gun. Like then
Right.
I have to make it where they can get a gun at some point. And even if it's just a line that is earlier in the movie, that makes you can do that.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's what is really important is that you have to work and make everything important. Once you like we started, once you start adding in different rule sets of like, oh, you need to, you know, be able to we need to measure your midichlorians. It's like that
Right.
doesn't make any sense. Why are you adding that into the story? If you want to sit there and say, um, you know, the yeah, the methane is, the atmosphere is methane. It's like you don't need to tell us specifically what it is. You can simply say it's toxic to
Right.
breathe. It's
Well,
toxic
yeah.
for humans to breathe. Period. And you just leave it at that, and that's fine because it's not important to the story.
Right.
The word
Exactly.
methane doesn't need to be in that.
Right.
It's like you're now giving us more details than you need. So suddenly you're telling us things that we go, oh, well then this is obviously going to be important, and then it's not.
Right.
It's
And
like,
so
well,
that's where I have the irritation with that medium amount of detail, right? It's like
yeah,
it's unfulfilling when you keep giving me little bits of information that then and then by giving them by fleshing out that information and not just leaving it kind of hazy, you're adding importance to it and you're saying like, look at this matters. And I go, okay, interesting. Like, have you ever seen in the movie where there's like a background actor and they have like a way too interesting of an expression or a face or whatever, and then like it's one of the reasons it's like actually kind of a problem with if you're a background actor, if you start getting recognized, because people don't want to start using you anymore, because it's like, well, now if he's ever, or the Wilhelm scream, like you
yeah, oh
can't
yeah, yeah,
unironically use the Wilhelm screen anymore. You have to be intentional about it, because now the audience has noticed it, and now that means that like if you include it, they're gonna go like, "That's the Wilhelm scream," right? So you
yeah,
have to you're putting it in consciously now, as opposed to what used to just be like a common sound effect.
yeah.
It's just a
It's
little too distinct,
yeah, it's a
and
similar thing.
right.
It's
So when you start drawing attention to things, we start putting importance on it, and so then it's like, okay, why did you put importance on all these things? And then if there's a reason to do that with the methane, if that's later on, you play with that concept, like that's a
yeah,
really cool reason to flesh that out. But otherwise, you should kind of leave it out of focus, right? It's sort of like
yeah,
in a frame, in a frame of a film, like you don't have everything in focus, right? Like unless it's like a wide shot of like a sunset. In that case, that is everything is the scene, right? That's the scene's about the wide shot. But when the scene's about a character, you drop other things out of focus. And if you were to rack focus from the main character to like a bartender behind them and then back to them, what you've just said is there's now a connection between the main character and that bartender. And if you went throughout the rest of the film, never bringing back in that bartender, everyone would be like, well, why did we throw the main character out of focus there? Focus on the background character and then focus on him again if it didn't matter. And you'd be like, there must be a cut. There must be a cut like scene where they interacted or something. Like you'd be puzzling that out. And so that's what
yeah,
you do when you give something too much detail, is you're saying like, oh, look at this is going to be important later, right? um and so then you have to like, you got to make good on that. And if you're not going to make good on it, and I think that the danger is, well, I'm going to start doing this with everything. I'm going to cut to his hand. I'm going to cut to the fork, and then cut back to his face. And then I'm going to cut to the bartender. Then I'm going to cut back to him. So you like, in that, in my mind, I'm like, oh, so something's about to go down. Is that fork going to be used as a weapon? And he's like, no, I don't know. I just wanted some B-roll. And I'm like, okay, then
yeah,
all you've done is throw me for a loop as an audience member. And the same thing
yeah.
happens
You're now
plot
using your
wise.
composition to
Right.
derail from what the audience is supposed to be, what your story's supposed to be telling, which,
Right.
yeah, which I think is good. And that's a good place for us to kind of leave off too,
I
because
think so.
that's kind of where it's at, is that like the more and more, and I've been watching a lot of movies recently, and you kind of do see it where it's like, I don't know why you just told me that, or why you're saying this about
Dude,
X, Y, and Z.
a lot of
And if
these
they just
modern films
stop you, do it better.
are so wasteful. Like I think part of the problem is like film is cheap, right? Like well, film is cheap, digital is free, right? And like
Yeah, yeah,
film the saying was film was cheap, but the answer is actually film was kind of expensive. And
Oh,
so
that's I will say like it's interesting seeing how Martin Scorsese's films now are so long.
yeah,
And I know people talk about like I looked at the runtime for Killers of the Flower Moon
yeah,
and I was like, no, no. Same thing with The Irishman. I
yeah.
saw how long it was and I looked at it and I thought, nope, I don't care what
I'm a
people are saying about
little
it. It's not worth my time.
I'm a little worried because I think with Dune coming out, like it's irritating. 'Cause I'm like, no, people like good movies, like people like good films, people like good video games, and like everyone's looking for trends all the time because that's how you get investment is with trends. And so
Yeah.
I get why Villanueva or whatever you say his name is saying this, but he's like, what Dune proves is people want longer movies. And I'm like, no, I really don't. I just
No, it
want
really
good. I want good movies, and if it's sometimes the people willing to make
it
good movies make long movies, but it doesn't mean I want every
if
movie
you
to be
can
three
tell a
hours.
if
I miss
yeah,
like a good like 95 minute, 100 minute, like 120 like just solid film. Give me like a good 100 minute film. I'm happy. I
yeah,
don't need it to
if
be
you
anything more
can
than that.
if you can tell a good movie, like if you can tell a movie in 90 minutes, why are you taking an hour and or in 90 minutes, why are you going to take like 1 hour and 60 minutes? It's like, well, can you like oh, it's because we need okay, if you can shorten it up, why are you not making it shorter?
Yeah, I just looked it
I
up because
can
it was like the sweet spot for me for film length, and it was a Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, and it's 100 minutes. It's a hour 40
okay.
minutes, and
Yeah,
I'm
hour
like,
40.
that's a nice spot for a film. I can knock out that time in my day to watch it and
Yeah.
not feel like I have to commit like multiple days or multiple watch
Yeah.
sessions. So yeah, no,
I
I
agree.
agree.
I agree. Two once it hits about the 120,
You
I
start
am
like
usually
antsy.
like
You start being like,
mm.
all right, how's
It's even then. I like I'll start picking it apart, being like, why we didn't need this, or this was
yeah.
too long, or could have tightened that.
Do you the
But
other thing I have?
regardless,
Do you have this? I have the little like antenna like just in my brain where like I'm watching something and there comes a point where I'm like, it's been 2 hours. This should be over. Like without looking at my watch, without knowing anything, like I just have this like like the movie's going and you kind of get this idea of like, okay, we're at the finale now, and then when it doesn't come, it's really weird. Or like a weird thing is
only
I didn't know Spider-Man the Spider-Verse one, the number 2, was like a part 1. I thought it was just like the second movie when I
oh, I
learned.
didn't know that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I haven't seen it,
Oh,
so
okay, so it's just a part 1, so that now you know.
okay,
But so you get to like the end of like the second act, and
yeah,
you're like, there's like we gotta have the like it's actually the third act, but whenever you have like it ends halfway through like the plot, I was
yeah.
like,
It's not really.
I was like
Yeah, it
sitting here
doesn't
going
count.
like, well, the film's got to be ending, and there's no way they can tie up all these loose ends, right? And it's not that I knew it had to be that short or whatever. I just it's like in my head, I'm like, this is the end of the film, but there's no
That's
time. And I was like,
interesting.
oh, it literally just ends on a cliffhanger. Oh, there's a comeback for part 2. Like, oh, okay, I get it. So this whole like I don't know, there's that like thing just goes off my head, or I'm like, okay, it's the end of the film now. How are they going to tie up all these loose ends? And then sometimes they can, and
I
that's like really
usually
impressive to me. But like half the time, I'm like,
No, usually it can feel kind of rushed. I will say this, Star Wars, I remember watching A New Hope recently. And it's really good. Like it's really like as a film, it's really good and really tight.
yeah.
Except until you get to the third act and the once they hit Yavin 4 and like the third act itself, it's kind of rushed.
Mm-hmm.
You're just like, oh yeah, this is going really like this is kind of put together. Which, again, I get it because they were short. Like you want to make a shorter movie,
Right.
and I can appreciate that. But you do feel that you're like, yeah, this is rushed. This was they needed to get this over with, and you just kind of go straight into the battle. It kind of just throws you in there.
I kind of prefer that. I've been thinking about that a lot. Like, would I prefer, like,
If I have to take that, if I have to take something that's rushed over something that is drawn out, I will take rushed every single time
yeah. But also, I
because
kind of like the fact that once you get to the third act, I forget who it was. I think it was Spielberg originally, who was like, once you have the climax, just leave. Like, it's
yeah,
such a great thing that films used to know how to do that they just don't anymore. Where
yeah,
like once the film, like once the Death Star explodes, there should maybe be like 5 more minutes of film. Like it just should be over. Like
I,
the idea that we should sit around after the climax and like talk
yeah.
to everybody and then do this and then like half of there's just so many modern movies that do it. Like half the superhero films do it, but because they're trying to set up like so many things, and you're like, guys, the movie's over. Leave. Like it's done.
So
Like
this might be there's I've got two examples, and then we're gonna just cut it.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah.
gonna leave. I'm gonna drop
Just
mic
walk
and
away.
walk out. Um, the I was thinking about that. That's the critique everyone has with the Batman
Yeah.
is that it's a
Yes.
great film, except for that last 30 minutes. If they had just cut it
Yes.
after
It
that, it
didn't
would have been
add
perfect.
anything. Yeah.
Didn't need it. It was so completely unnecessary. It contradicted the rest of the film. It
Yep.
didn't make any sense whatsoever. It kind of ruined the film.
Yep.
It's still a good film. I still like it. I still have gone back and watched it again. But yeah, the last time I watched it,
It just
after the
feels
Riddler gets
so
arrested,
tacked on.
I turned it off. I was just
Yeah.
like, I don't need to see the rest of it. But the other thing that could get me in a lot of trouble is I was looking at Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, and they could have, if they had removed Frodo going back to the Shire and just condensed it to be their basically they start traveling back and then they go directly to the Grey Havens.
Hmm.
And basically, that's when the explanation is done. You would have cut out probably a good 5 to 10 minutes and it would have tightened up that resolution because that one dragged on because no one really knew. Like, okay, well, when is it over now? Is it
Yeah.
over now?
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
over
The
now?
six fades to black. Yeah.
Yeah, and in reality, yeah, that's the one thing they could have cut out because it was a bit
So
redundant.
so I'm with you as a 10,000 foot view. However, I'm totally against you as far as the actual experience watching that in theaters, like for the last, like, because you've been on a journey. That's the only one that I usually give a green flag to is like, I am okay with being an indulgent at the third movie over a 9 years of films coming out, however many years it was, and like you've literally grown up with these characters. We could be a bit indulgent before we just send them up, which is sort of like I have the opposite problem with the new Star Wars films. You're like, I don't feel attached to anyone, and then I don't even get a send off. You just get like, this character just dies, bye. And you're
Yeah.
like, oh gosh. So like, there's like no reverence. Like you want that
I
in Lord of the Rings. If you're when you're in like 2001 and they're wrapping up, like that's brilliant. Years later, you're watching it and you're like, this one would be a lot tighter without it. Like,
no. Even at the time, I remember people being like, "This was too long. This was too long. This was too long." And I get that. That's
yeah,
what I mean is that you have a couple of times, and then all you have to do is condense that. Basically, take that section out,
yeah,
take what you were trying to get, and put it and sprinkle it in the other parts, and you will you get to the resolution, get to the end faster, and it does make it a bit better. Which is again, yes, you're right. It is later on, and it's a bit armchair, but I'm sticking with it. Again, as someone who loves Lord of the Rings, both
all right.
the
Well, on
books and
that
films, it's not good for that, but I'll get in
controversial
trouble.
note
Yeah.
on Rob throwing a rock at a hornet's nest,
Listen,
let's
one
wrap
day
up.
one day you will accept that my taste in art and movies is superior. And
I
I am right. And the truth is, I'm gonna make you sit down and watch that one day, and you're gonna be like, ah, shoot, he's
I,
right.
I think I
He's
think
right.
I
Could
think
be
you're
could be a little
mixing
tight.
up your taste being right with you having a reason for why you have the taste you have. I don't disagree you have a reason. I just don't think your reason's the only I just gave a counter reason, which is
It's
like
not the only reason,
I loved
but it
hanging
is
out with
the
these characters.
superior.
Oh,
It is the
okay. The
superior
superior
reason.
reason. The
I
appeal
appreciate
to
everybody.
hierarchy.
We're gonna end it. Appreciate everybody. If you have made it to the end, go ahead and please like and subscribe it if you enjoy this type of content. It won't stop us from making it. I'm still gonna do it, but whatever.
Rob will talk to a brick wall if you let him.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
mean, you don't have to let me. I'll do it.
All right. We'll see you guys in next week, next Friday. Adios.
Use the outro.
No, I just said end. I always